Hello again, those of you who are joining us. I'm Patrick Lawrence once again, and joining me today is a really wonderful author named Peter Kaufman, who has written, and not surprisingly, a wonderful author has written a wonderful book. It's called The New Enlightenment and the Fight for Free Knowledge. Many of us are perfectly aware that we are in one or another kind of war over the control of information, the narrative, and all that. It's Peter spent 10 years on this book, if I'm not mistaken, and how very well timed it has turned out to be. And he brings a really splendid sense of history to it, which I especially appreciate, and a really graceful, wonderful writing style. The New Enlightenment, if you come over here, Seven Stories Press did it, just out recently. I can't recommend it more strongly to people who are interested not only in the past, but in our circumstances today. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for such a gracious introduction.
Pleasure. Peter and I are, let me count, we are 3 towns apart up here in the Northwest Connecticut wilderness. Peter is over in Lakeville and I'm here in Norfolk. Peter, let's start with some of this wonderful history you bring to things. And it's just impossible to read all you have to say about the past without thinking constantly of our current circumstances. But let's just stay with the history. It's wonderful. You start with William Tyndale and go through the Encyclopedists. Really very interesting how you cast these things in the context of a continual, as you say, fight for free knowledge. Please talk to us about that. Tell us about Tyndale, just for the sake of an interesting story, right?
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm a recovering book publisher myself, and I worked after leaving the book publishing industry, or trying to leave it, as a video producer, and thinking about all the affordances of video, and video as its own medium distinct from print publishing. I'm working on something now, a sort of manual of style for video producers, like a Chicago manual, but for I began thinking about the comparisons between video today and print publishing today. This is a long way, by the way, into answering your question about William Tyndall, and where we are, relatively speaking, in terms of the development of video as a medium and the development of print. And print is now snarled in all kinds of troubles with respect to how copyright law is constructed, with respect to who owns what, and specifically in some of the sectors that matter, I imagine, to your readers and viewers of this, like scientific, technical, medical publishing, especially during a worldwide pandemic. And it turns out that, like, when you explore the history of printing and you get real into it, you can't but fall on William Tyndall, who was this guy, like, basically 120, I don't know, depending on where you cite Gutenberg or the Dutch or the others on the continent, a century after printing really sort of got started, which is kind of like where we are with video, by the way, a century or so after, Edison and stuff. Tyndall was trying to do like one thing, which was to translate the Bible and publish it. in a way that the Bible could get into the hands.
From Latin to English.
From Latin, Greek, Hebrew, all the other languages. He was also working off Luther's German text. The guy knew something like 7 languages, you know, well enough to translate the Bible. And just his translation, by the way, brought more to the English language, phrases, terms of art, idiomatic expressions than Shakespeare. We owe more to him for some of the stuff, you know, than we owe to Shakespeare. It's amazing. But he was trying to do this at a time when translating the Bible into English was forbidden. Not just forbidden. It was a crime against the church, and it was a crime against the state, the king, various kings, various states that he traveled through Europe to avoid getting charged with. Ultimately, he paid the you know, he was
The highest price, right?
highest price. He was strangled and burnt at the stake at the same time. Pretty, not even in the northwest corner of Connecticut do we do that to people anymore. You know, he really, it's tough.
Yeah, they really wanted, your description of that is rather graphic in its gory way. They really did not want to hear more from him, did they?
They did not.
What was that issue? What was that issue? Power, I suppose, but can we reduce it to a single word?
Yeah, it's exactly power. And, you know, the people who were fighting to keep that power were monsters. I call the whole, you know, traverse of then and now the monster verse. You know, these people who were basically believing that if you put the Bible in the hands of a person, or in the ears of a person, more likely, because in mid 1500s most people didn't read, but they could be read
to them. Yeah.
Yeah. It would somehow allow them the ability to challenge the sole authority of the Pope and the sole authority of the king. And the way he translated also changed people's understanding of what the difference is between penance and penitence, between, you know, what the Bible actually seemed to require in its original text versus what the Bible was suggested to require by the elaborate and corrupt apparatus that the church established. So it was deemed a threat. In fact, people were burnt at the stake for having the Lord's Prayer in English in their pockets back then, like a scrap of paper with a Lord.
Yeah.
Like,
so,
that was enough.
So you wrote, Peter. Keeping the Bible in languages unknown to the common man, the Latin and the others, was a form of, what do we want to call it? It was a way of maintaining control, huh?
It was totally that, because the Bible was the one book, like your one event in your world, you know, in 16th century Belgium, or, you know, yeah, Germany, or was basically a weekly thing at church where you'd be part of a community service, right? And you would be read things, and if you were lucky, you could read them yourself. Maybe you could read them yourself if you had texts. But you'd be read things and you'd be told what they meant. And it was kind of like the equivalent of watching Fox News all the time. You know, it was like there'd be a guy up at the pulpit who would be lying to you about what the intent of the, you know, what is it?
Some passage or other.
Yeah, the Pauline epistles, if you want to get into it, or some of the other things that matter to us now, the Book of Exodus, what all that meant, and New and Old Testaments. So yeah, it was like your one thing, and you couldn't challenge. You couldn't write a letter to the editor. You couldn't raise your hand in a Zoom call. You couldn't raise your, it was a very one to many uneven relation.
Tyndale's fight was won long after he was departed.
Yeah.
But let's go on to the Encyclopedist. I just love the way you put the Encyclopedist in the context of this fight for free knowledge, the masterpiece of the Enlightenment. Okay. Most of us know at least a little bit about Denis Diderot and what the Encyclopedist did, right? The first sort of amassing of the sum total of human knowledge, Western knowledge. But again, you put it in terms that you suggested, or more than suggested. This also was a challenge to authority. That thought had never occurred to me. Talk about that too.
Well, like when I start in the present, because I live in the present, notwithstanding some of the old books that I managed to amass in working on this thing that's around us now. But like I was thinking, I work at MIT, and I was thinking about Aaron Schwartz, who was hounded.
Yes, we must talk about him.
By people. He was discovered in an MIT utility closet trying to download all these issues of old scientific journals, a service called JSTOR that universities subscribe to. And, he was hounded to the point where he was charged with all kinds of crimes. And I list those charges in great detail in the first chapter, alongside, how Tyndall was charged by Jacobus, Latomus, and some of these other, hyenas. And Tyndall met his death at the stake, but he, was aware that this would happen, and that he was being chased, and that he was ultimately likely to pay for it. And Aaron Schwartz was also chased to the point where he was so despondent he died by suicide.
Unbelievable. His world must have been so, forgive me, his world must have been so different from mine. I have always had a hard time understanding why someone would kill himself over legal charges and
he didn't think that he could get away. He felt that, my understanding is anyway, he only saw the darkness in his future. And so I start with thinking about Schwartz and its connection to MIT, his death's connection to MIT, where I work. And so the second chapter, thinking about the access to knowledge and stuff, I start by thinking about Wikipedia. And I think about what a glorious project that is, and how it deserves all of our support, which it really does. And if we talk about nothing else,
I will comment on that in a while, Peter.
Yeah. So in thinking about Wikipedia, I went backwards also to try and find the historical cognate to Wikipedia, and that is the French Enlightenment Encyclopedia. It's quite a direct lineage, traceable and stuff. Did the DNA test on Wikipedia, you find the encyclopedia. And these people recognized that no one really was a fan of equipping the ordinary citizen, any reader, anybody who could afford a chance to look inside that encyclopedia, collected all the world's knowledge at the time, or that was their objective. It was a threat to church and state again.
Interesting. It's terrific the way you relate these sort of people to our present circumstances. A question here. The Adam Schwartz case, to fill in readers, listeners who may not know, Peter will interrupt me if I get it wrong, was essentially, was he a graduate student or a PhD student or something?
No. He was in independent computer programmer, hacker.
Okay. He was dedicated to making freely available the immense universe of scholarly articles, probably numbering in the millions, Peter can tell us, by working, as Peter explained, in a closet in an MIT building, downloading all this stuff. That was his project, right? And it was obviously a legal transgression. What strikes me about it is in this case, we have university. It's one thing for the king to say no, right? I want to control. In this case, we have universities, disseminators of knowledge, acting forthrightly against the dissemination of knowledge, right? It's kind of a convoluted dimension of this, and it's not the last time we will run into this, right?
The most understated thing that I say in the book, and I have a book here that's full of understatement, is in a footnote that it wasn't MIT's finest hour.
Yeah, I remember that, right.
But it was a combination of universities, copyright holders, and the federal government who were pursuing him. There are 14,500 some Secret Service paper files on him. He was considered to be an agitator. An agitator against what? He had written a guerrilla open access manifesto that a lot of people still want to quote from. I think it's useful to just remind us how it says, information is power. That's what we talked about right at the beginning of this conversation. But like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves.
Well, and now we are invited to think of Diderot and Tyndall and other such people as the heroes of the past, the heroes of your story, the fight for free knowledge. Certainly their heads stick out in the crowd. And we are invited to think of Adam Schwartz and Snowden and Julian Assange as their contemporary counterparts. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly believe that such an invitation is warranted, and there are a lot of people between, Aaron and between Tyndall and between Diderot and and Assange or Snowden in particular. There are a lot of people who do fight to free knowledge, who are not necessarily going to be as famous or infamous or punished. All those people have that in common. The ones we mentioned anyway. And my hope is that this book somehow continues to inspire not just the radical, progressives, but people in their everyday lives who recognize what the stakes are about power and information.
We have coming up to the present, we have altogether now a war over, basically it is a war. I mean, you use that word yourself actually, and suggest we need to fight it. And as you say at the end of your book, even violently, right? We'll talk about that. Over the control of information, privately for gain, publicly for political power, right? The prize here in our terms today is the narrative, right? And we can take, was it Schwartz who said knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. we can take that and turn it upside down and say ignorance is powerlessness, right? And in this way, we are in very, very serious trouble. We're tipping into the question of censorship, and why don't we just tuck right in? What are your thoughts on this? I find it utterly shocking, Peter. I imagine you're a little younger than I am, who isn't these days, but to even debate the validity of censorship,
Yeah.
it's just, what planet am I waking up on, right?
Yeah.
And here it is. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. No, I could
Wait,
talk about that.
let me add one thing. I imagine your research and writing occurred a smidge before this absolute onslaught of censorship um, sort of flowered, right? Let's tuck into that.
Yeah. I mean, so in the lives that I have led or whatever, the first one really was being trained as a Sovietologist. I speak Russian. I, spent a long time working in Russian, Soviet, Central and Eastern Europe, yeah, former Soviet FSU, places. And I still run a foundation that promotes Russian literature and translation. It happens to be a disease you can't get rid of, the love of Russian literature.
Bit like being a journalist.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So censorship is not too far either, from my present ever, or what informed me, kind of coming of age, coming of old age. But yeah, there was an elaborate system, and that's the third chapter after the Encyclopedist stuff and after the translation of the Bible stuff that the Soviets managed to set up, inheriting various imperial systems of thought control. But the Soviets really took it, to the next level and established this kind of unbelievable system. Maybe the most extreme examples we've seen, Romania, East Germany, Albania, even, which alleged to be anti-Soviet, but certainly drew some inspiration. And these were systems where literally, like, I remember being in Bucharest in 1990, the typewriters were still being registered by the state. Like, copy machines were registered in Poland, Xerox, like you can own one of those privately. Only state-sponsored institutions could. So censorship involves a lot of things. It's worth unpacking. It's worth, it's what you can say, but it's also the means of production. To use a term that never gets old.
Do you find our circumstances in this way worrisome, Peter?
Totally. And in, part of the chapter I'm advocating, and part of the book, a large part of the book, I'm advocating for thinking about what it is that, brought us out of that world of totalitarian thought. And it was basically systems of independent publishing that were community, samizdat, which means self-publishing. It, the world of underground literature that wasn't dependent on the superstructure, substructure that was created by the state.
But our situation now, Peter, it's very, very convoluted. You can't really make out who the ACs are and who the DCs are. You may disagree on this point, but just to take a perfectly obvious example, I don't consider the New York Times a friend of free knowledge at this point. I am very sorry, right? Maybe you do, and I know a very great many other people do, right? If you read it in the Times, it's true, right? I used to think that comparisons between mainstream newspapers in America and Pravda were
Yeah.
quite considerably overdone. I don't think they are overdone anymore, right?
Yeah.
The proximity of the mainstream press and to unroll this for listeners, the New York Times is essentially the master of ceremonies for the rest of the American press. It signals what can be said and what cannot, right? That's just the way it's been for a very long time, right? And the proximity of the New York Times to power is extremely unhealthy, right? I don't want to get into the matter of lying. That's quite complicated. It does take place, but lying by way of vocabulary and things like that. But
Yeah.
misleading by omission is rampant. And so you can't really, there is a war on, but we better be very clear, or as clear as we can manage, as to who the friends of free knowledge are and who aren't. You
Yeah.
have thoughts there?
I do. Yeah. And some of them stimulated just by this conversation. I feel like the New York Times, ultimately, what is the New York Times? It is a business that is, responsible to whom? Is it a public trust of some kind? No, it's become something significant to us. It's become something meaningful to us, almost like Google. When you open, web, so you think, okay, this is kind of almost like a utility that I'm going to use. That's but the New York Times, Google, other sources. These are companies that are beholden to, that answer to the market. And I don't know if it's an accident that, the major stories of our time, like literally when we talk about communism or whatever, the collapse of the Berlin Wall or the 2008 financial crisis, the invasion of Iraq and the Iraq War and the issue of weapons of mass destruction. And I mean, some of the colossal things, 9/11, like what was going on before and during and after. I don't know that, yeah, it's complicated because, Daniel Ellsberg would not exist without the Washington Post,
Yeah,
New York Times.
there are moments.
There are moments, and those
high
moments
notes,
are
yes.
triumphant moments. So it's complicated, and it all has to do, I guess, with the people. I tend to believe now, reflecting on things in this idyllic paradise of the Northwest corner that we live in, where you go for walks and stuff, yeah, especially during the pandemic, that it's all about the people. It's all about the people you work with. It's all about the people you converse with. It's all about that. And really it's about the people and the brains in their heads, what they're thinking, what they're doing because of what they're thinking. And so some days the New York Times is run by, and parts of it are run by, the bravest souls, who are out there. And sometimes it's not, but it's not predetermined to run that way, in a good way. And I think other institutions maybe are. Like, I would look to NPR before I would look to the New York Times or the Post for reliable, verifiable information, or the BBC, especially the way it was a while back. And I would watch Amy Goodman interviewing people before I spend time watching MSNBC.
Yeah. All right. This question of censorship, to take it a little further, we've got a piece of news came out this week. Jen Psaki, the press spokesman at the White House, let it be known that the White House is now going to be sending Silicon Valley, or maybe Facebook specifically, directives as to what should be eliminated as disinformation. As I was saying to my other half a while ago, the idea that a government that lied to us about the Iraq invasion and countless other such matters is now appointed to determine what is true or not, it gets a little Orwellian here, Peter, right? And we've got these Silicon Valley CEOs who don't come over to me as overly intelligent people. Under a very great deal of pressure from Capitol Hill, they've been, I lost count, they've been called before the Senate, I think at least 5 times in the last year, pressured, censor more, you must not carry mis and disinformation. You know, there's an iron fist here. If you don't oblige us, we will break you up. Well, that is, by any serious reckoning, indirect official censorship, right? I think various questions that you bring up, such as ownership and so forth, come into play here, right? We'll get to those in a minute. But my point at this stage in our exchange is, don't you think the moment someone is appointed or claims the role of judge in what is valid information and what is not, you have a challenge to free knowledge on your hands? That's it. I don't think there's any exception to that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the notion, I'll go on a little further from it. The notion that people are no longer
You
capable.
paid for this microphone. Yeah.
What's that?
You paid for this microphone. Yeah.
The notion that people must not be able to determine for themselves what's true or not. We have to do that for them. It's extremely dangerous. One of the more dangerous notions around, right? Who has the authority to claim that role or appoint such people, anyone to it? It's really a key question. This question never asked.
No, it's a great question, and there are many questions embedded in your question. Like, first of all, I think there's a big difference between being appointed or self-appointed as the, arbiter of fact versus claiming to be appointed or claiming to be that role. Especially a big difference between being appointed, which happened in Imperial Russia, and there were actually literally state censors and pre-revolutionary France, and it exists in various forms still around the world today. Like between that, this is the challenge I think that Jen Psaki and government has to deal with when it comes to social media. Is there's a vacuum of editorial decision making and leadership when it comes to Facebook, and so this is not a newspaper where everybody has a story meeting on Monday and for the weekly thing or a daily. This is where anybody can post anything and communities can catch on fire real quick. So there is some hankering for order, that no longer that exists in a old issue of Newsweek, perhaps, that doesn't exist on Twitter.